So 2 Sundays ago, I had to embark on a perilous journey. I alone had to take my daughter Hollis from Asheville all the way to her grandmother's house in Goldsboro. Now, under normal conditions, that is not a big deal. It's about 5 to 6 hours, which is a long time, but it is pretty manageable. We've done it plenty of times. But on this particular Sunday, it came at the end of a very, very long day. Normally, when we take Hollis to her grandmother's house, we try to plan it so that we leave earlier in the day. I'm sure that the parents and grandparents, they know the game. You leave when the kid is rested and fed and in a reasonably good mood, and you've got a betting chance at a somewhat pleasant drive. But if you miss that magical window, you start kind of rolling the dice. Well, 2 Sundays ago, we not only had church in the morning, but after church, if many of you remember, we had church council, and then we had charge conference, which was in the afternoon with all the Methodist churches in the Asheville area, which meant by the time that everything was wrapped up and we were leaving, the ideal departure time was somewhere far, far, far in the rearview mirror. On top of that, I had a conference meeting in Chapel Hill the next day on Monday, which meant Sunday was the only time that we could make this drive, and so ready or not, Hollis and I were going to Goldsboro. Now, for clarification, I had already kind of accepted my fate in this. I knew this had all the markings of a pumpkin at midnight situation, if you know what I mean. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. So I packed her tablet, I took the Nintendo Switch, a coloring book, all of her favorite toys, and snacks. So many snacks. We had salty snacks and sweet snacks and crunchy snacks. If it could be eaten in a car seat, I had stuffed it inside of her little bag. And my hope was that I could just sort of pin my ears back and make a run for it. Like the Millennium Falcon trying to make the Kessel Run down the I-40 East. That's a reference for my Star Wars fans, just FYI. But here's the thing. My defenses, they fell quickly. The snacks were devoured within an hour. The coloring book was colored post-haste. The toys lost their appeal, and the tablet and the Nintendo Switch, which normally have magical endless staying power, were cast aside in boredom. And then, right on schedule, came the dreaded phrase, "Are we there yet?" You know, the funny thing about that question is when it's asked, have you ever noticed you are never there yet? And even more interesting is that, you know, it's curious, asking it hundreds of times in a row, over and over and over, in fact, does not make time go any faster. And so needless to say, my daughter was tired of riding in the car. She wanted to be at Gigi and Papa Jay's house, and her annoyance was growing faster than I could put miles on the road. And she wanted to be absolutely certain that I knew how she felt about all this. And so she told me from the back seat, she said, "Daddy, I am frustrated." And I said, "I know, sweetheart, I know." But that wasn't enough. Because she paused for a second and then she said it again, this time slower, emphasizing the words she wanted to make sure I knew. She said, "Daddy, you don't know. I am very frustrated." And here's the thing, honestly, I get it. From her perspective, nothing was happening. She was just stuck, buckled in a car seat, looking out the window at trees and roads and signs and a stretch of highway that kept going on for miles. And there was a big part of me, in all honesty, that wanted to say the same thing right back. "Darling, I am frustrated too. I don't want to be here stuck in this car. I want to be there. I want to be done. I want to arrive." Because being in the in-between, it's exhausting. And honestly, we all know what that's like. We know what it's like to find ourselves in seasons where we're not where we used to be, but also not where we want to be. We all know what it's like to wait, to live in the middle, the in between, the not there yet. And most of us, if we are honest, do not handle that very well. We live in a world that is built to avoid waiting. We have microwaves for our food, 2-day shipping for practically everything, instant streaming for shows and movies, and drive-thrus for coffee and prescriptions and groceries. We are used to, in many ways, pressing the buttons of life and having something happen. In a way, we are trained to believe that if it feels like nothing is happening, that, well, something must be wrong. And so when life does what it eventually always does, when we hit those stretches where the scenery doesn't change as fast, or where the things that we're praying for, they don't seem like they're coming, or the answer that we're desperate for doesn't show up quickly, well, like Hollis in the back seat of our car, we can find ourselves asking, are we there yet? Is this over yet? Is anything actually changing? God, are you doing anything right now? We might even find ourselves at some time saying, I am very frustrated. The truth is, waiting can feel very empty. And in those moments, it can feel like nothing holy is happening. It can feel like God is already down the road at Grandma's house and we are just somewhere on I-40 simply trying not to lose our mind. But what if the waiting isn't empty? What if the in-between is not just the dead space between real moments, but a place where God actually does some of God's most important work? This Sunday is the first Sunday in a season that we call Advent. It's the stretch of the church year that carries us toward towards Christmas and the birth of Christ. And it's an ironic season if you think about it, because it is unapologetically a season about waiting. Every year we set aside 4 weeks to do the very thing that most of us spend the rest of our lives trying to avoid. And we mark it with wreaths and with liturgies. We light candles, but not just any candles, candles with the names hope and peace and joy and love. Which, if we're honest, feels like a tough sell when it comes to waiting. It almost sounds like an oxymoron. Think of the last time that you were stuck in traffic. Were you overwhelmed with hope? Did you feel peace? Was your heart overflowing with joy and love? Probably not. In those moments, we feel annoyed and trapped and powerless and kind of just plain tired. And yet Advent declares or dares to challenge our usual assumptions about waiting. It quietly insists that waiting is not just wasted time, not just dead air between the real parts of life. Our season of Advent says that there is something happening here, even if we can't see it yet. Advent says that there is meaning and growth that can only be formed in the in-between. The claim of this season is that even here, even in the sometimes frustrating, not there yet, that God is still meeting us. In a way, it's that same tension between here and there, between promise and arrival, that plays out in our scripture readings for this morning. Because our reading drops us right into the life of a man named Abram. Most of us know him or think of him as Abraham, but this is before the name change. And by the time that we meet him in Genesis 12, he's not a blank slate. He has a home and a family, land and animals and servants and patterns and routines. He's a man who knows what life looks like. In other words, he's settled. And then all of a sudden, God steps into his life with a disruptive invitation and says, go from your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. God shows up and names where Abram is, and he speaks of a place that he will be shown. But I want you to notice what is actually being asked of him. When God tells Abram to leave his land, the word that's used there for land, it gets often translated into like country, which can sound like nationality or leave your nation or cross a border. But in Hebrew, the word eretz is both bigger and smaller than that. Eretz, the Hebrew word, means dry land, like the region, the territory, but it also refers to a specific piece of ground that you stand on, like the soil under your feet, or the plot of land that you farm, or the place where your tent is staked. It is your livelihood and your roots all at the same time. Land meant crops and grazing and income, but it also meant memory and ancestors and identity. And so when God speaks in this moment, he's circling every circle of belonging, gets named, and then it gets peeled away. And after all of this unmooring, God's instruction to Abram is simply go. Go to the land that I will show you, future tense. Think about that. The destination, it's not described, not with like coordinates on a map, but as a land that will be revealed as you walk. That means God's call here is not just a single act of traveling from point A to point B, but he's calling Abram into a new posture, a new way of living, a readiness to both leave behind and to accompany. In other words, Abram is being called into waiting. He's promised great things, but he will not see those great things quickly. And what's remarkable is at first how wholeheartedly Abram steps into this. Genesis 12 simply says, so Abram went as the Lord had told him. No debate, no bargaining. He just gathers his family and his possessions and he steps onto the road. And I imagine that in that moment, you know what? Waiting probably didn't feel that heavy yet. The promise is fresh. The adventure still feels like adventure, and most of us know that feeling too. At the beginning of something, when it's new and the call is clear and the next step is visible, we can say yes with a lot of energy. We tell ourselves, yes, I can wait. Yes, I'll be patient. Yes, I'll trust the process. At the start, well, waiting doesn't always feel like waiting. But over time, the in-between, it starts to weigh on us. Like my daughter Hollis, all of a sudden the roads keep stretching out longer than we assumed, and the things that we expected to happen quickly do not. And so that's why I love that Scripture doesn't leave Abram in Genesis chapter 12. I love that we get to follow along in the story, that we get to see what comes next. Because in Genesis chapter 15, we get another picture of what waiting can look like. And to be honest, this one feels a lot more human. The chapter begins with, quote, sometime later. And so time has passed, miles have been walked, and Abram has followed faithfully. But the promise of a child and a future still hangs unresolved in the air. And so it says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. But Abram replies, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? And since you have given me no children, a servant in my household will inherit all of my wealth. I want you to feel the vulnerability of this moment. Because here the man who, quote, went as the Lord had told him, finally lets this quiet ache that has been bouncing around in his chest come out of his mouth. It's not that Abram has stopped believing in God or anything like that. It is that the waiting has finally worn him thin enough. He can no longer pretend that the gap between promise and reality doesn't hurt. I think this is where Abram feels kind of the most familiar. Because we know what it's like to reach the sometime later. We know what it's like to reach that point and to say, God, I hear all the languages about blessings and reward, but what does that really mean if this one thing that I have been hoping for still hasn't come? What good is all of this if I still find myself waiting? We know how waiting can feel empty. We know how waiting can feel lonely. And like Abram, we question not only God's timing, but if there will ever be an end to this particular stretch of road. And this is where a small but important detail in Abram's story is so vitally important, but at the same time, it's so easy to rush past. Because I want you to notice something about what God says to Abram in chapter 15. In chapter 15, before God says anything about stars or descendants or future generations, before God revisits the specifics of the promise, God first addresses Abram in a different way. God starts out by saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you." In other translations, it says, "For I am your shield." I want you to notice that before God talks about destination, God first talks about presence. Before God reminds Abram of what will someday happen, God reminds him of who is with him right now. God's first response to a man living in that long middle of a promise is not a timeline, it is first companionship. God is saying, first, I know that the waiting feels endless. I know that you are tired, but you are not doing this alone. I am your shield. I am with you here in the middle, not just somewhere far off in the destination. Do not fear. Abram, in that moment, he's so overwhelmed and focused on the unfinished business of his life that he almost blows past that assurance. He goes straight to the practical problem. What good are all of your blessings if I don't have a son? And guess what? Even in this, God does not scold him for speaking vulnerably. In fact, God meets him in that very frustration. God hears the words, but then leads Abram outside and invites him to look up. God shows him the stars in this moment of overwhelmed frustration, and he shows him the stars and he gives him comfort. Under the night sky, in the middle of nowhere, Abram is given a visible reminder. And the stars, they don't erase the waiting, they don't make the journey shorter, but they pull his gaze from the ground right in front of him up to something that is beautiful and vast and trustworthy. A reminder that the promise is still there and that the end of the story is still held by God. But just as important is the quiet truth that has been spoken from the very beginning, in the long and in the slow middle, in the days when it feels like nothing is moving and we just aren't there yet. We are not abandoned. The God that calls us out, the God that calls us to go, is the same God who walks beside us, who holds our fear, who hears our frustration, and keeps whispering, I am with you, even in the waiting. After Hollis told me that she was very frustrated, I made the decision for us to stop, to take a moment and to be together outside of a car. In all honesty, we were only about an hour from Gigi and Papa Jay's house at that point, and so I could have just powered through. I could have told her to hang on and just to keep waiting. But I heard what she said, and I took it to heart. And so we pulled off at a Starbucks. And we went inside and we got matching cake pops, because sometimes you need something just a little bit small and sweet to remind you that the world is not so terrible. And I remember we sat in, we ate our cake pops. We sat at one of those little round tables, legs swinging, chocolate smeared all over her face. And she said hello to every single person who walked in, whether they wanted it or not. And I remember over time, I watched her as she brightened back up. We were dad and we were daughter, sharing a treat and being together in the in-between. But eventually we did reach the point where we had to get back on the road. And I told her we needed to ride in the car some more, and she promptly informed me that she was frustrated and did not, in fact, want to ride in a car anymore. But that's when I told her. I said, I know you don't like waiting. And Daddy doesn't like waiting either. But isn't it good that we get to do the waiting together? And even if it's not fun, I bet that the two of us can help each other get to Grandma's house. And that's just what we did. Neither of us didn't suddenly start enjoying the drive. Neither of us stopped wishing we weren't already there. But we were together in the waiting. And because we were together, there was something soft and steady and good that settled in that stretch of road. And it didn't erase the frustration. It didn't make the miles shorter, but it did make that middle feel a little less empty and a lot less lonely. Friends, I don't know what your waiting looks like right now. I don't know the thing that you're tired of carrying, or the road that feels too long, or the prayer that you're not sure how to keep praying. I can't name how faithful or how frustrated you may be feeling, but I do know this. You are not sitting in that in-between place by yourself. God is with you, even in the waiting. The same God who called Abram to meet him under the stars is still whispering, do not be afraid. Still promising, I am your shield. Still speaking words of hope and protection, even when nothing seems to be moving. And because that God is with you in the waiting, it is not empty. And so there is still room to grow, to breathe, room to keep taking one more faithful step. And so may God help us wait just a little bit longer. And may we notice God is with us in this Advent season. And may we be accompanied by God and with each other until the waiting gives way to what comes next. Amen.